This book is just absolutely devastating, and I finished reading it and I just didn't know what to do with myself, to be honest. Like, it's just unfathomable to me that people can behave that way to each other. Just horrific. Hi, welcome back to Bookish Brummy. My name's Mel and this is my weekly review video where I talk about all of the books that I've read in the last week. Now, when I left you last Monday, I had just started reading Beloved by Toni Morrison, and I was about 30% of the way through. And I didn't really say much about the book because obviously I hadn't finished reading it then. But now I'm in a position to actually talk about my thoughts on this book. Now, this book isn't very long. It's about 300 pages. But what I will say from the start is that this is not a bingeable book. It was a really, really heavy kind of book, and I can completely see also why it won the Pulitzer Prize for fiction. So, as I say, the author is Toni Morrison, and this was written in 1987 and won the Pulitzer Prize in 1988. And this story is about, it's set in Kentucky, or roundabouts Kentucky, in the 1800s, like 1880 roughly, like late 1880 I think. And we are following our main character, who is called Seth, and she is an escaped slave, basically. So she was living on a slave farm, and initially she had liked her owners. They had been fairly good owners compared to some owners, and on that farm with her, she was the only female slave, I think, and then there was 6 men. And actually, just as she'd come onto that farm, there was an elderly black woman who was also a slave on that farm, and one of the men on that farm was her son, and so he actually was able to pay for her release. So the elderly woman leaves the farm, and this just leaves Seth on the farm as the sort of housekeeper and the cook and the cleaner. So anyway, as I say, their owners were fairly good as far as owners went, and she liked talking to the lady of the house. They weren't whipped or beaten, and they were sort of asked for their opinion at times, which is not sort of a normal thing that would have sort of happened to slaves. Anyway, the lady of the house basically lost her husband, so she was then taken really poorly herself, and so there wasn't really anybody to actually run the farm other than the slaves. And she brought in, I think it was like a nephew or something, to come and oversee the farm, and he did not think about slaves in the same way that the lady of the house and her husband had originally thought about them, and he was a lot harsher, and he began to beat them and put them through terrible ordeals. So basically they decide collectively that they're going to escape from this farm, which they do. And so our story sort of starts a little bit later on, after Seth has actually escaped from that farm with her children. And when she escaped from that farm, she went to go and stay with the elderly lady who was the mother of one of the men on the farm. And this is because in that meantime, Seth has actually married that man, and they've had 4 children together. And she has, they have 4? They had 3, and then she had 1 on the way. So they had 2 sons and a daughter, and then she was pregnant with 1. So they decide that their only way is to actually escape from this farm. So, well, as I say, we start the story later on in the future, after Seth has already escaped with her children. It's something like 20 years in the future from when they were originally working on this farm, which is called Sweet Home Farm, I think it's called. And in that time, she had managed to find her mother-in-law and had stayed at her house with her, and her mother-in-law had since died. Now, as we begin to understand that everybody else in the local vicinity, like the other people in the black community, actually avoid the house that she lives in, and she's not bound to anybody, so she's no longer a slave, but she does go out to work in another white person's house and does kitchen work, as we understand it. And she's left with 1 child who is, I think she's about 19-20 years old from from what we can tell, and her 2 sons have basically left her. Now we know that when she sort of initially escaped the original slave farm, she had 1 daughter, 2 sons, and was pregnant with a child. So the child that she was pregnant with is the one that is currently now living with her, which means that the daughter died, and that's what a lot of this book focuses on. It's like how that daughter came to die, and the trauma that has basically put on Seth as a mother, but also how that has affected the household that she's living in and even the neighbourhood that she's living in. And this story, as I said, it's not a bingeable read. It's really, really, really hard going. Like, the subject matter in here is really upsetting, but it's still totally worth a read. But I feel like as I was reading it, I would read some and then I would have to put the book down to really think about and digest what I had just read, and think about how I was actually processing this, because it's not just about the trauma of losing a child, it's also about the trauma of slavery. And we actually learn about the trauma of the slavery from several different points of view. So we have Seth's trauma, and obviously her escape and all the things that happened to her in that, and then as she's trying to move forward with her life, and in that 20 years since she had actually escaped, how she'd actually sort of been living her life after the trauma of being a slave. So we see it through her eyes, but also the mother-in-law, who is not alive in the present telling of the book, but she is called Baby Suggs, and basically she is in Seth's head a lot of the time. The things that she had said to Seth, and the sort of wisdom she had passed on in her life to Seth. And we can really see between Baby Suggs and Seth, the ordeal of being a slave woman and actually having children, and whether or not you can actually love them or permit yourself to love them, because like Baby Suggs, I think, had 8 children, and every single one of them had sort of been taken away from her, apart from the one who she had been able to stay with for some time, who then paid for her freedom. And she's talking about, like, literally as fast as you try to form a relationship with your child, it's taken away with you and it's sold on. And even with Seth, like, she overhears certain conversations when she's actually on that farm where she's a slave, and they're talking about her as though she is a dog who is just breeding more slaves for them. They're just not, like, she gives birth to these children, like both women give birth to children, but those children are just not considered theirs. They're like, they belong to their slave owners and they're taken away, or in Seth's case, 2 of her children had actually run away, and that's really, 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 really sad. And then we also experience trauma from the perspective of her daughter. So her daughter, Denver, has never been a slave. She's never been owned by a white person at all. She's always been free, because she was actually in Seth's belly when Seth escaped, and then they've been living with Baby Suggs. So she is aware of how white people are treating black people, and she's aware of a danger in society to black people, and in her life she never even really leaves the house, never even really leaves the front garden, because she's heard all of these stories from her mother and from her grandmother about the dangers of white people. So she's agoraphobic, more or less. And I don't think she really, really questions that. It's just she's used to living her life basically in her house and stuff. But there is one moment where she's thinking that she needs to leave the house, and that's when we start to learn that actually this little girl had never actually left the house before, or really left the house, due to the perceived dangers that were outside. And then there's obviously how her mother has been, that has affected her, her mother's obvious trauma from around being a slave, and then the trauma around her sister's death, which is tied into that. So then we obviously have trauma from the perspective of these 3 generations of women in this book to contend with, but then we also do learn a little bit from the male side as well. So a man comes to the house after the 20 years who had initially been a slave on the farm that Seth had been a slave on, and he has been through some stuff in that time. So he comes and he finds her and they sort of start a relationship. But again, like, in the same way that we're talking about how a mother, whether or not she's allowed to love her children, again, from the men's side, we have this, can you actually fall in love with each other? Would you be taken away from each other? And again, he is trying to get over that trauma or work through that trauma. And that really affects sort of the relationship between him and Seth, because both him and Seth are trying to, work through this idea of being actually free to love, another human being. And there was a really good actual quote in the book. I'm just going to see if I can find it to read it. Yeah, so it says, "A woman, a child, a brother, a big love like that would split you wide open in Alfred, Georgia. He knew exactly what she meant, to get to a place where you could love anything you choose, not to need permission for desire. Well, now that was freedom." And I thought that was really, really, really powerful. And to me, that is a really big theme in the book, is, the permission to love another person. And I think obviously we take that for granted today. Obviously, we are loving our brothers and our sisters and our family members, and nobody's coming in and stopping us and, taking those away from us necessarily. And obviously in slavery, slaves were just treated like animals, like subhuman, and their feelings about the matters of the relationships that they had developed with, their family members and their children were never ever taken into consideration. And that really, really gave me, something to think about in this book. It was a massive sadness in this book, but definitely needed to be written about. But anyway, if we go back to the gentleman in this book, not only is he obviously trying to deal with his own trauma, he had been a slave on various plantations, had escaped several times, been taken back in, and now he is, we believe he's a free man. But he's still obviously suspicious that he's going to get taken back into slavery again. But some of the violent things that he is memorising, like when he's remembering back to his time on the farm, his escape from the farm, and where he's been since in that 20 years, it's just like absolutely, truly shocking. And this, as I say, this book was a really, really powerful read. I thought, Toni Morrison had written some really in-depth characters who, as I say, this is a remembrance. So in this story, really, it's not like there's something that you like waiting to happen. It's just kind of like, you're following our main characters and just seeing how they can manage to make a life together after everything that they've gone through, and them remembering bits of that essentially, and that all comes together to tell a story that's not told up front. So it's kind of a story that's buried within the story. So I'm not going to say more about that because I don't want to ruin that, if you obviously want to read the novel. But yeah, it was a really, really moving story, but also a really difficult story to read, because it is just, the very idea that human beings could treat other human beings in this manner is just absolutely horrific, What I would say about this story as well, there's obviously an element of, well, not obviously because you don't know if you haven't read the book, but there's an element of magical realism, I think, in the book. So the reason that our characters are sort of going through their memories about how they feel about certain things and what's happened to them in life is all centered around the death of the one child, like the one daughter, and that daughter's spirit sort of comes back to haunt all of our characters, and that's what's stimulating them on this journey with their memories. And so yeah, there's this like magical realism aspect to it, which I didn't mind. I thought it worked really, really, really well as a way to get the characters to look back into their past and, you know, piece that all together as to how they had gone from, you know, that slave farm as to where they were now and everything that they had been through in between. I also think, you know, you could sort of draw a parallel in a way to a book that recently won the Pulitzer Prize, which was James by Percival Everett. So that won the Pulitzer Prize in 2025, and I did read that book last year actually, so I'd read that obviously before reading this one. And that one is also dealing with the trauma of slavery and how, you know, to actually deal with the future going forward after everything that's happened to you, and the perception of, you know, what white people are going to do to black people. However, there's a slight difference, I think, in the writing style. So in James, there's more of a satire as we follow James. So James is also has escaped slavery and is talking about his journey in, you know, basically trying to get onto the right side of the river, basically to be a free man and not captured back into slavery. And James is also like a rewrite of Huckleberry Finn, I guess. Now, I've never actually read Huckleberry Finn, but you can definitely read the book without having read Huckleberry Finn, you know, to see the story that's trying to be told from James's perspective. And again, you know, that's like obviously shocking, but as I said, there's a bit of satire in that book, and it had a couple of moments where you're just like, oh, that's absolutely ridiculous. It's probably true, but it's absolutely ridiculous. Whereas I felt that this book there was absolutely nothing to laugh at in this book at all. This is very, very, very serious. And James is serious in its own right, but as I said, like it's a bit lighter. And I have read Percival Everett's other work, and I did feel that compared to some of his other work, that James was not as intense as some of his other novels. So maybe that's a little bit easier for people to digest, whereas this one just comes in and it's really, really, really hard hitting. So I'd have to say, like, out of the two, I think I preferred this one. I think this one hit much, much harder. But I think that if you're wanting to understand a little bit about the impact of slavery on black people, and you know, just some of the things that happened. I mean, obviously we don't live in a time where this is actively going on right now, so I think that you can forget about some of the absolutely inhuman and awful things that were done to slaves, you know, and these books are actually really highlighting this is what happened, you know. So I think if you're wanting to kind of learn a little bit about that, I would actually recommend both of these books as a sort of reading, like reading them back to back. I think that they sort of complement each other quite well. So yeah, I think overall that I would give this 4.5. And as I understand it, this is the first one in what's called the Beloved trilogy. So I do have the second one in this trilogy called Jazz, and they're not all in this trilogy, they're not all following the same character, Seth. But it's, as I understand it, it's like the impact of slavery in each book, basically, on the characters in that book. So I think Jazz is set in the 1920s in America, where this is set in the 1880s in around about Kentucky. So I definitely recommend this if you are interested in, I say, learning more about slavery. Then definitely this is one to go for. And definitely a tearjerker as well. I think it's, yeah, I mean, if you're a human and you're reading this book and you're empathetic to other people, this is just really, really, really sad, but worth a read. So after that, I have to admit, like, I was like, that's probably one of the most serious books that I've read this year, and emotionally did sort of take it a little bit out of me. It's Small But Mighty, definitely. So I wanted to get into something that was a little bit more light-hearted, because I was like, I don't think that I can take another really serious heavy book after that one. And also I didn't want to take a serious heavy book after that one because I wanted time to digest actually what I had read in that book. So I decided to go for Connie Willis's To Say Nothing of the Dog. Now, this was written in 1998, and this was the Nebula Award winner in 1990. So the Nebula Award is the award given for best, well, it's a prestigious award for basically the best sci-fi book in the last year. And I did want to include all kinds of awards on my list. And I've had this book sat on my shelf for some while. And this book really appealed to me because it's basically about a historian called Ned Henry, and he's travelling back in time. And it sounded quite comical on the back, a little bit sort of Jasper Fordish, and I do like Jasper Ford. But also the setting for this book is in Coventry in the West Midlands in England. Now, I'm originally from Birmingham, that's why I'm called Bookish Brummie. I don't live in Birmingham anymore, but Birmingham is in the West Midlands, but I still live in the West Midlands, and Coventry is very, very close to me. So the fact that like this is basically about Coventry Cathedral, and it's about a travelling historian, and I trained as a historian at university, I thought there's probably quite a lot that I'm going to like about this book. So yes, we're following Ned Henry, and initially this book is set in 2057, I think it is, or 2058, so in advance of the time that we're in now. But he also has to travel back to the 1880s, so it's weird that both of these books are actually set in the same decade, but he's also travelling back to the 1880s because he's trying to understand where a missing item from Coventry Cathedral has gone. So basically there's something called the Bishop's Bird Stump. I had absolutely no idea what that was when this book started off. But basically the Bishop's Bird Stump apparently was seen in Coventry Cathedral just before it was bombed in the 1940s in the Second World War. But after it had been bombed, nobody could find it. However, apparently this thing is absolutely unbreakable. So Ned's job is basically he's trying to find where this is. In the course of him trying to find that, he becomes what they called time lagged, which I guess is the equivalent of jet lag. So he gets sent back into the 1880s for a rest, basically, into Victorian England. However, he does not end up having a rest. He ends up in all kinds of shenanigans with some guy that he meets at the train station. So when he sort of comes through the portal into the train station, and I think he turns up in like Oxford or somewhere, and then he ends up going down to Muching's End, and then from there he does end up in Coventry at some point, but essentially he meets this guy and they end up on a boat in which he cannot row, so that just ends up really entertaining. This bloke has a dog called Cyril, and then they meet some ladies, and then it all goes on from there. So he ends up like sort of stuck in the past in the 1880s with this other Victorian man, and it's just, this is quite an entertaining book. It's got a really, really good sense of humour, and it did give me the feel of Jasper Ford. So if you like the Thursday series by Jasper Ford, I actually think that you would really, really enjoy this book. However, what I would say about it is I feel the pacing is a little bit off. So I was invested to read this book because, as I said, the setting and the fact that it was about a historian, and also had a feeling it would be a little bit Jasper Ford-ish, and like Jasper Ford. But I've got to be honest, like nothing really seemed to be happening for about 150 pages. Now this is quite a big book. This is just over 500 pages. So I had enough, you know, there was several hundred pages in this, like about 350, where I really, really got into the story, and then it became a page turner. But for the first 150, it felt very slow, and it felt like it was taking a real long time to actually, you know, get into the story properly, and I found it a little bit hard going, you know, and I think if it hadn't been for the subject matter that I was really interested in, I might have been tempted to actually give up on this book, if I'm honest, but I kept going, and I'm really, really glad I did, because I had a really, really fun time actually reading this book, and it was just what I needed, I think, to reset my brain into something that was obviously a lot more light-hearted. I had a couple of chuckles while I was reading this, so yeah, I think I would rate this a 4. I'm not going to rate it any higher, as I say, because for the first 150 pages, it was a bit slow going. But I thought all the characters were really entertaining. I really liked the involvement of all the animals in this book as well. That kind of made me laugh. And the fact that, you know, there was a dog in here and there was a cat in here, I feel is very British. You know, and there's lots of references, obviously, to British history in here, but also like little social quirks of the British as well, which I just really enjoyed. But I think Connie Willis is actually American as an author, so I definitely think she must have spent some time over here with some British people to, I think, write these characters in such a British way like that she did. So that was my actual main concern, I think, is when I realised it was an American author, was how would she actually accurately be able to capture the British sense of humour. But I really feel that she has. Actually, I think she's done a very good job. So yeah, recommend this if you're into sort of time travel books, or definitely if you like the Thursday series by Jasper Fforde. So yeah, 4-star. So they actually took me most of the week to read those, but I did have some time to choose my next book. Now, on my list of awarded books that I've got on my shelves, you know, I had like Booker Prize, International Booker Prize, Pulitzer Prize, Women's Prize for Fiction, you know, all the usual ones. But I realised that I didn't have anything on my shelf that was representing the horror genre. And I haven't read any Stephen King for over a month now. I didn't actually read any of him in March. I did read a lot in King Family February, obviously, because it was about him. But I didn't read any in March, and I really didn't want another month to go by where I didn't read any more Stephen King. And then it occurred to me, I didn't have any awards for the horror genre, so I had a look at the Bram Stoker Award. Now, the Bram Stoker Award, I think, has been going since 1988 or 1987, somewhere around that time. And that gives out several awards a year to like the best novel, the best graphic novel, the best short story and things like that. So I thought surely Stephen King must be represented in here from, you know, the last 40 odd years. So I went for a look, and actually I had lots of choices to read from Stephen King in there. So I decided to pick Lisey's Story, because this is one on my shelf that I have not yet started reading and really did want to read this one. So this was written in 2006 and it won the Bram Stoker Award for Best Novel in 2006, although I think the award got presented in 2007, but yeah, it did win the 2006 one. So this one, like a lot of Stephen King books, is a bit of a chunky monkey. It's about 700 pages long, and I'm just at the very beginning, really. I've read 100 pages, so I'm just really not that far through it at the moment, but I should imagine that I will spend most of the next week going through this one. But already I like it. I think in the first 20 pages, I've got to be honest, I was a little bit confused about what was going on because of the local language, or basically the way that our main character is speaking. She basically has this shared set of words, I think, with her husband that mean certain things between them, and she keeps kind of using them as she's sort of talking to her husband in her head. But then there's also, she's remembering what other people have said, and Stephen King has written what they've said in their dialect, in like, I want to say like not Kentucky, like southern parts of America. And again, I was finding that really hard to follow with the kind of local dialect and the shared language that she had with her husband, that didn't really mean anything unless you were one of them two. So that was a little bit difficult, but I've now actually sort of moved on past that, and I'm starting to really get into the story now, so I have high hopes for the rest of the book. Obviously I can't review this until next week when I've finished it. Obviously I don't know where I'm going to move on from this, but obviously I've got a lot more award winners to read for the rest of the month, so I've still got a Booker Prize winner that I'm looking to read. I've got quite a few Pulitzer Prize winners on the list as well that I'm looking to get to, and also quite a few Women's Prize for Fiction winners to get through. So far this month we have had a Pulitzer Prize winner with Beloved by Toni Morrison. We've had a Crime Writers Association Gold Dagger winner with Chris Whitaker's We Begin at the End. We've had a sci-fi Nebula Award winner with Connie Willis's To Say Nothing of the Dog. And we have had, what else have we had? Last week I also read, let me just check my notes. Oh yes, we've also had the International Booker Prize winner with Time Shelter by Georgy Gospodinov, and that one so far has rated the highest out of all of the books I've read. That one rated at a 5 stars. So I can't believe I actually forgot that one. I was trying to remember. So we're having a really good month so far. I'm really enjoying award-winning April. Let me know in the comments down below if you have read any of the books that I've read so far this month, and what you thought of them. And also, if you've enjoyed this video, please give me a thumbs up, and if you'd like to see my future content, please hit the subscribe button. Thanks for watching this video. I've really enjoyed making it, and I'll speak to you soon. Bye!